Hello, members. Hello. So I just thought we'd better start. So if I can just formally welcome members to the meeting of the Audit and Standards Committee, 27th of September 2021. As members will be aware, unfortunately, Councillor Giowan can't be with us tonight. So our first order of business is to elect a chairman for this evening's meeting. Do that formally. So can I ask for a nomination for chairman for the meeting, please? Is that seconded? Thank you. Any other nominations? No. All in favour? That's agreed then. Councillor Barnes, it's yours.
Thank you very much, Robin. May I add my own welcome to this meeting? I think I'm advised quietly that this may be Robin's last meeting of the Audit Committee. And if that turns out to be the case, I think we ought to minute formally our thanks to Robin for all his services to this committee over the years. There will be other opportunities, I'm sure, to thank him for all of his other services. The minutes of the last meeting have been circulated. Can I take them as a true and accurate record? In which case I will sign them. Apologies for absence. We have Councillor Giowan and Councillor Kirby Green. I don't think anybody else is missing. Good, in which case no additional agenda items, I take it. And disclosure of interests. Patrick.
Yes, I'm not sure that it's appropriate, but on item 10, the environmental health, it refers to referring clients to the Hastings and Rother Mediation Service. And as I'm a trustee of that service and I take money from the council, I thought I ought to declare that at this meeting.
I think a personal interest, yes.
And the same also Hastings and Rother and the same.
Right. We've got both those. Excellent. If Alliance Homes comes up at any stage, both you and I, Councillor Thomas, will have to declare an interest, but it will be a personal one. In which case, we move to Part A, and we have no standards reports. So we can move straight to Part B. Much of this we've already seen, but I will actually ask Trevor Greenlee to introduce the update to you. Welcome to the meeting.
Thank you, Councillor. Can I just check, can you hear me properly? Yeah. So you have before you the audit findings report for our work on the 2019-20 accounts. So those are the accounts for the year ending 31st March last year. We have obviously been working at these accounts for some time. We have previously reported our findings to the December committee. What you see before you is a updated report, which reflects the fact that at the time of our original report, our work was still in progress, and subsequent to the reporting in December 20, we then discovered further issues which required additional work involving both ourselves but also involving the council, and that work has taken some time to finalise, and therefore the accounts have had to wait until we're in a position to sign, which hopefully we are indeed now. So given the nature of the issues, we have updated our report, and we will say a little bit about the issues that have caused the further work. But most of the report remains unchanged, and I don't propose to go through it from A to Z. It's simply to focus on the issues which caused the further work. So at the time of our original report in December, we had identified that there were two assets where the valuations for the year ending 31st March 20 had been based on incorrect measurements. And we'd agreed that with officers. However, the values involved were such that, taken together, they did not result in a material amendment to the accounts. So at that point, we anticipated that we would be able to give an opinion, albeit that there were these adjusted errors. Subsequent to that, in finalising our work, we discovered two other assets where, again, there had been errors in measurements, and that had led to errors in valuations. And when we took the additional two assets and the original two together, then the impact in terms of aggregate value was material to our accounts. So officers were content to amend the accounts. Unfortunately, the value of the amendments was such that we had to consider if there was also potentially an impact in the previous year account. And indeed, that proved to be the case because the measurements that have been used for 2021 valuations had also been used for valuations in previous years. What that then required was for the council to get updated valuations for those years. And that required getting information from third parties, essentially the council's valuers. So a little complication was that the council had changed valuers, and therefore to get this information for the previous year, they had to go back to the district valuer who had been their valuer for the years in question. They then had to gather the information, and that took some time at their end. I'm not too sure about the ins and outs, but it seemed to require a little bit of time. So I think we finally got the information, or the council finally got the information from the district valuer in May or June. Maybe Robin knows more precisely, but I think about that time. And when we had that information, then obviously with the council and ourselves, we were able to review it and decide on the amendments required. And those amendments have been made, and in the accounts before you, which is the subsequent agenda item, you'll see that there's a new disclosure note which explains the prior period adjustment and which explains the impact on the accounts as a whole. So that issue we have effectively reported on detail in the report you see before you. That's a change to what was reported in December, obviously, because there's an update. There are a number of other minor changes. Those minor changes are issues where our work was again in progress in December, and we have subsequently finalised it. They don't, I think, lead to amendments in the accounts in terms of numbers, but we did agree with management that there would be some changes to the narrative disclosure notes, and those again are reflected in the dated set of accounts which you see before. So I don't propose, I think, to say more. I'm more than happy to take any questions on that issue or on any of the other adjustments that we're reporting today.
I guess I could just ask whether Rother property is based entirely on a square metre measurement, and is that a fair valuation for the current market in terms of price?
Well, only certain assets, the values for only certain assets would typically be dependent upon floor area and measurements. So many of the assets will not involve those components in the calculation. But as it happens, some of the council's biggest assets are valued on a basis which involves area measurements as part of the component. So there are four major assets where that is the case, and we have reviewed them all as part of this work. So what I think we can say is that there are no other assets of any significance that are valued on a measurement basis that would need to be considered. So I don't think that there's any concern, or should be any concern, that there are other assets where issues of this type could arise.
I think it increases the sum we have to put aside for depreciation, but other than that, there's no practical effect whatsoever.
No, that's correct.
Everybody happy, therefore, to note the revised report? Yes, you're moving, Councillor Barnes, I take it. And Councillor Cortell seconding. Yep. And everybody agreed. Yep. I don't think we need to keep you here unless you want to stay. It seems a long journey for very little, I'm afraid. But there we go. Right, now we move on to the statement of accounts, page 39, which again, obviously there have been some small changes in, but basically this is as we saw it before. Robin, are you going to introduce this?
Chairman, it was effectively, this just picks up on what Trevor's just been talking about, and for sort of transparency purposes, we thought we'd represent the full statement to members with those changes that have been agreed with Grant Thornton, so that members have the opportunity to see the actual final version. There was a previous delegation where the chairman of the committee could have signed off on those, but we thought it more appropriate to bring it back to members so you get a chance to see the actual final version. So again, happy to answer any questions, Chairman.
Yes, major changes in note 4, where we're talking about assumptions. And I think that's the only significant change, isn't it? Councillor Cortell.
Chair, I have a number of questions because I didn't realise at the last meeting that these accounts had arrived at the last minute, and I hadn't had a chance to look at them then. So if I may ask some retrospective questions.
Can you call out the page that you're asking the question about?
Page 52. I'm scrolling myself towards it. Staffing. I notice that there are 228 full-time equivalents in 1819 and 230, that's 2 up, in 1920. Now, I believe that during that financial year, there were in the region of 20 redundancies. Do correct me, Robin, if I'm wrong on the figure. And I've noticed that redundancy costs carried into the current financial year are 176,000 in resources, 63,000 in acquisitions, transformation, regeneration, and 22,000 in housing. Yet the net number of full-time employees has increased by 2, and the net number of posts has only gone down by 2. So I'm just a bit perplexed as to what the purpose of the redundancies were, unless there was a real need to recruit some other posts.
I think, Chairman, I'd have to come back to the member with a detailed explanation of the movements between years, so you can understand where things have gone down and where things have gone up in terms of the number of posts that the council had within its establishment. I haven't got that information to hand tonight. I would have.
I guess I should have written to you beforehand.
Yeah, it would. But I can produce that information for you.
I think if it's that kind of detailed question, I think Robin really deserves notice.
So
I don't think he can be tasked to know all the business of every department. Did you have another question, Councillor Cortell?
I do. I notice, I'm very pleased to see that there's now a column for budget and a column for revised budget, which is something I'd raised as a suggestion at Overview and Scrutiny Committee some time ago. My question is, when was the budget revised?
Chairman, the budget is continually revised, so that each time you receive a report through monitoring, it will be revised for any environments that have taken place. So it is a continually updated position. So that has been the last position that we had in terms of the budget that was presented to them.
So, in fact, members just note revisions to the budget.
But only if they are beyond the environment limit. It's over 250,000. So anything under that will be delegated through to officers to deal with. So it's as I say, it is continually revised. In the old days, if we go back long enough, we would have a formal revision of the budget when we set the following year's budget, but we don't follow that process anymore. We have it effectively completed as we become aware of issues and previous approvals from members in terms of budgets.
I think it's quite important to understand that we control the process through a scheme of delegation. So we've approved limits beyond which officers cannot alter the budget without recourse to the Cabinet or, if necessary, full council. So I'm saying that not because you don't understand it, Councillor Cortell, but because we're in a public meeting. I think it's important the public understand.
Thank you. It's a very clear explanation from both of you gentlemen. I hadn't appreciated that, and I'll ask Robin privately what the parameters are.
I think Overview and Scrutiny, of course, look at the quarterly figures, and I think that is a good moment. If you see any change that you want to ask about, it's probably a good meeting at which to ask it.
Okay, thank you. I do have some further questions. I'm sorry if I'm...
It's all right. This is a place for asking questions. So.
Moving on to page 55, there's a number of projects in a table on the right-hand side. Sorry, at the bottom of the page. I noticed that there was a £240 budget for the cemetery entrance, but only 7,000 of the 240,000 was spent. Could I ask how that project is progressing, or is that something that is too detailed and I should have asked in advance?
Yeah, as far as I'm aware, that project is now complete, so the expenditure would have been in the following financial.
Thank you very much. My next question is possibly a slightly technical one. I believe we spent 7.8 million on Glover's House, and that was a substantial part of the property investment strategy.
Sorry, which page are you on?
55.
Still on 55, okay.
Yes. In fact, I believe Glover's House is referred to on another page as well, on page 62. On page 62, it states that it was purchased for 7.8 million. But on page 55, it indicates that the money wasn't spent. So is that purely a timing issue?
Chairman, the table shows that 7.8 million was budgeted and 7.8 million was spent, with a variation of 32,000.
I profusely apologise. I misread that.
Timing there is just.
I think it's there.
It's there.
Yeah.
Yes.
I'm sorry. I misread that as I was going through things. Page 56. There's a reference to disabled facilities grant budget. And it's gone up from 0.8 million to 1.6 million. I mean, I'm delighted with that, but how did that happen?
Yeah, that reflects the actual grant that we receive from government to support disabled facility grants. So when we set the budget quite often we don't know what that figure is going to be. So we've used a historic figure in that of 797, and we got 1.6 million. And actually, we spent quite amazingly, I think, 1.3 million of that. The remainder probably were already earmarked for schemes as well. So I think it's a good news story. The money has considerably increased. If we went back again a few years, we were probably around the £500,000 mark. It then went up to £1 million, but only half of it was funded through government grant, and the council was funding the other half. But in recent times, they've recognised the demand for this sort of improvements to people's homes to enable them to stay at home. And therefore, they've increased substantially the amount of money available to local authorities to do it. So it's a good news story.
Thank you. Page 58, Chair. The pension liability seems to have decreased from 25.3 million to 17.8 million over the past 12 months. I didn't quite understand that.
Chairman, you and me both. Effectively, what happens with the valuation of the pension fund, it looks at the long-term liabilities of the fund and the assets of the funds, the investments that are made by East Sussex Pension Fund Authority on behalf of all the pension authorities within that. So, and over time, obviously, those liabilities and assets will change in value. So, depending on when they took that valuation, things will change in that valuation. It is further explained throughout in the report, in the statement notes, in a lot more detail. Again, we wouldn't want to go through it in detail tonight because it is very complicated.
I'll refer to the notes.
So I'm quite happy to run through with you on how the pension fund liabilities and assets come together and how that affects the bottom line of the authority. So it's a long-term liability, so it's usually something that we tend not to worry about tomorrow. It is a long-term liability that the council may or may not have to meet. If you think about it, if the markets improve in terms of asset investments, then the value, the liability will go down. And we go back, yeah, you talk about the past, but if you go back long enough, we may well have been in a surplus position where we actually have
I think if you go through all the papers, Councillor Cortell, you'll find that quite a lot of detail on life expectancy and people like that. It is an incredibly complicated thing, even if you actually serve on the pension board.
Yes.
But I'm sure East Sussex will vouchsafe you a full explanation through, Robin.
Thank you. If I may move on to page 59, I notice that we are committed to reducing the staffing structure by £500,000 per annum. Is that realistic? And are we still committed to achieving this? And how are we going to achieve this without cutting services?
Yeah, and so that was part of the projection at the time. Obviously, we revised that now, so there's a more up-to-date medium-term financial plan which sets that out in a slightly different way for members, so you can see where the saving targets are now at. So that's information based on the information at the time. It's now been updated, and there's a lesser figure around that. Although, if you look at our programs of work around our financial stability program, clearly those will lead to job losses at the end of the day, or post losses, which is probably more likely, where we're able not to have to recruit into post because we've created that capacity within the workforce through investment in technology or whatever it might be. So there's a whole raft of work around that, but there are revised and updated figures now in terms of our future savings.
Thank you very much.
In a sense, we're looking at history here. I think that kind of question is probably better addressed at either here or overview when we're looking at the monitoring of how the budget is going. But if we don't deliver savings, we shall miss our target, which is quite a tight target, on reserves at the end of the 5 years. But of course, productivity is always possible. You can invest to save. It doesn't have to be done necessarily by individual human beings. There are ways of actually investing to save money. But I don't know whether the lead member would want to comment? I wondered if you want to comment with this. Really about
Well, yes, as Robin said, I think things have moved on and things are moving on all the time. The Financial Stability Board has met recently and come up with a load more good ideas and changes. But, you know, as Councillor Cortell is aware, the problems we have are quite serious with finance. And, you know, he says, how can we do this without cutting services? I don't think we can necessarily, and that is the issue that we do face after all of this time, and this can being kicked down the road all this time. Services that somewhere somehow are going to be affected. I don't think we've ever shied away from that. And as Councillor Barnes will know from being on the council for some time, it's been around probably for the last 8 terms. But this is where it may well happen. But we're doing everything we can to make sure that is either lessened or avoided.
That is my last question. I'm very grateful.
I think I was able to announce the place of parish council that council is giving lots of 10,000. I don't know if it's coming out of that particular, and if so, how much?
Chairman, I'm not aware of take up. It's under Joe Powell as the head of service who leads on that one. But yes, it does come out of the overall disabled facility grant funding that we receive from government. So it's part of that. But it's effectively because the size of the money that we get now, we're able to sort of diversify how that's used, still in accordance with the grant conditions in order to make best benefit of that money. So.
Yes, but can I preface it by saying I second to none in my admiration for Robin's omniscience, but if you don't give him notice of detailed questions, you can't expect a detailed answer.
Oh, can you hear me? Yes. So thanks to him, I can ask that question of Robin. But what happens when all the money is used up? Then, when every parish council says yes, we'd like 10,000, we can prove we need it.
Yeah, I mean, there's clearly a limit. I think that was set on the amount of money that was available under the scheme when the report came through to cabinet. So once it's gone, that's gone. It's finished. So, but the priority for me was always to make sure that the funding we received in year was available for proper disabled facility grants as per the previous scheme. So the money we're using to fund the parish work tends to be the carry forward unspent amounts from previous financial years. So it doesn't actually affect the in-year money that we receive. So it does ensure that the residents are able to access that funds if they want to.
No, it's very interesting. I think it's a very important point. So just to sort of get my own mind clear on this, we're spending an enormous amount extra, which is wonderful, on the disability grants, not far short of £1 million more, which is amazing. Are we getting that money substantially from the government then, or does it come out of the Rother budget?
That is entirely covered by government grant.
Okay, very useful. Thank you. Excellent. Yeah. Thank you.
If everybody's completed their questions, can we now take note of the one substantial change, and with that, take note of the accounts? We've already approved them, so I don't think we need to approve them again. Everybody happy with that? In which case, let us move on to the internal audit report. Gary, do you want to introduce this?
Yes, thank you, Chairman. This is my usual quarterly report. Fairly straightforward, brief on this time. It covers current progress against the audit plan, internal audit activity in the first quarter of 2021-22, and finally the progress made on implementing outstanding audit recommendations. The current position, which is in paragraphs 3 and 4, shows that progress on the 21-22 audit plan, the current year plan, is currently running about a month behind target. This could mean that fewer audits are completed by Q2, but hopefully things will catch up thereafter. I'm just sort of forewarning the committee just in case you think we haven't produced many audits in the next quarter, so that could well be the case. Summary of audit findings, summary of audit activity to 30th of June. We issued 3 reports in the first quarter of 21-22. The executive summaries to which are reproduced in Appendix A, which is page 131 onwards. The audits are data protection, estate income, land charges. Main issues found in each audit are shown in the relevant executive summaries in the section entitled Level of Assurance. All these reports were given a good or substantial assurance rating, so there's no areas of significant concern. Finally, then, the implementation of the audit recommendations, which is paragraphs 8 to 10. Progress on the outstanding audit recommendations has been followed up as I do every quarter, and the current position is summarised in Appendix B, which is on the tables on page 136. The older audit recommendations, the number has not changed since the last quarter, and there's been some movement on these. None of them have been resolved during the quarter, so that's why we've got the same number. Better position on the more recent recommendations. I think all but one is done now, and that's good. There's less for me to chase up next time. That's all for me. I'm just happy to take any questions.
Are there any questions? Yes,
I
Mr.
just
Farmer.
need to
No,
repeat-
sorry, Mr. Farmer.
Sorry.
And then Councillor Thomas.
Yes, I have a number of questions. You talked about the old outstanding from 1819.
Yeah.
I gather most of them sit with Robin, who's here now, and I'm just wondering if he had some comment as to why these are been outstanding for so long.
Chairman. Chairman. Yeah, there are a number of recommendations, and largely they are issues that we've been tackling for a while, or we've had to effectively move things on for various reasons. If I can just run through what they are. Procurement recommendation there relates to our relationship with the East Sussex Procurement Hub. We have had repeated delays in terms of finalising service level agreements with the Procurement Hub. Hasn't stopped them working with the council in partnership, and we continue to do so on a very successful basis. But the actual formal arrangements between us and Wealdon District Council haven't been completed. It's been further delayed recently because the Wealdon approached the council to discuss their future fee for delivering that service. I think they are seeking a substantial increase, so we need to understand what that is for and what the council will receive as a result of that increase in fee, if we can accommodate it. That's why there's been a further delay, and I'm still waiting on a final fee proposal from Wealdon. In terms of council tax report, I think this is largely to do with updating our write-off procedures, in particular to give us a bit more efficiency within the officer corps, so greater delegation from members. It usually goes through to cabinet for approval, anything over 4,000, but we're looking at that process in order to make it more streamlined and efficient for officers to get write-offs where they are unavoidable, for example, through IVAs or other agreements that have been in place for people when we need to write that debt off to make sure our debt is a sensible amount. ICT and network security. We are due to release a new process that we've applied in terms of how we apply policies around IT use. There's a new system that the IT department have recently acquired, and that will be rolled out to both officers and members in terms of how they use our IT systems. And it's a very proactive approach to looking at it, because the support from the company that provides this software to us, they'll update the policies as things change. And therefore, it's a very real-time kind of approach rather than the one we've had previously, where we waited a year or two before updating things and then resubmitting them to members or to officers. So I think it's a very positive change, but that's why things have been delayed on that one. In terms of Ict governance, that's around business continuity. And what we've done, again, the delay has been because we've been trying to complete things, but actually the pandemic has really shown that our business continuity needed a fundamental rethink. It was quite a few realizations that continuity plan probably wouldn't work in reality, because it didn't reflect what actually happened for something like the pandemic. Because it was, business continuity tends to be around getting things fixed and up and running as quickly as possible. But actually, the pandemic was like an ongoing, and continues to be ongoing, and therefore our whole approach to delivering IT changed in that period. So we've been working with our insurers in order to come up with a more meaningful business continuity plan that suits the way we're going to work going forward now and going forward, but also to pick up the fact that we've fundamentally shifting the way we deliver our IT, particularly the use of cloud as well, needed to be reflected in our business continuity plan. So yes, we have been delaying, but the landscape's changed as well. So it's further delayed us being able to complete that work. But that should be ongoing and come back, I'd hope, to members by December. We're expecting a report from our insurers, I think, anytime soon. So that should be good. The creditors one, two aspects to the creditors recommendations, and they both relate to our financial system, Unit 4. And within our Unit 4 system, we have a 2.5% tolerance on invoices. So anything above that compared to the order that was made, we'll throw a flag up, and in theory, it should go back through the process. There's a couple of technical issues which is causing us a little bit of a problem around where orders and invoices are not matched by that, to up to 2.5%. If they're over that, then there's a couple of issues that we need to resolve. But there are technical issues with the system that we haven't been able to resolve with Unit 4, and they're ongoing. And I can't give you a timescale on when they may resolve, because it does depend on the third party helping us resolve those. I think that's covered it.
A sticky selection. Yeah. Well done, Robin. That's a very detailed answer. I have a couple of other questions on the. I'm used to seeing audit reports that have some detail when you made recommendations of what they are, who will be actioning them, and the timescale. But you don't seem to have any of that detail in these reports. It may just be the way you operate differently than I'm used to. Yeah. I would have thought members would want to know that sort of information.
No, that's true. We don't ordinarily report the detailed audit findings. I sort of cover it in the summary, and I pick up the key points. If we ever have a high risk recommendation, I do report that in full. It's just we haven't had any for a while. So if we ever get any more, well, if we will do at some point, if they have a high risk, you will see what the problem was, what the recommendations to put it right, and what the agreed action is to put it right, and a named officer to do that. So I mean, we've got all that for the lesser, the medium, and the low risk ones in the audit report. It's just we don't report them all up. That's all.
So you just deal with the high ones here in this committee.
Yeah,
so just so I understand.
Because obviously the high risk ones will make the wheels fall off the cart. So that's the ones you need to know about. So.
I talked at the last meeting about the huge increase in the capital programme and concerns of monitoring these projects and how well they were, the risks involved in them. Have you considered that you maybe ought to be auditing Alliance Homes rather and their activities? Do you have any plans to do that?
We're considering it, yeah. I mean, I've got to produce a new plan for next year in 6 months' time. So considering that, but it depends. You know, I'm not sure what the responsibility is for that, whether it's ours or not. So
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you for that question, because that's really the reason I'm here tonight. Was that Cabinet and indeed myself made a commitment that we would involve both the other and scrutiny committee to scrutinise the activities of Alliance rather Alliance Homes rather, and I'm sure you wish to declare your board as your board members of that. But the scrutiny needs to scrutinise. But this committee, have said, would really want to make sure that we audit and make sure everything is absolutely crystal clear and in the open. We've had too many horror stories of other councils, and we're not going to go down this road of the likes of Croydon and Slough that have got into real mess with their housing companies. And the key to that, I think, is to be absolutely crystal clear and transparent right from the word go. So I was hoping to bring that up a bit later under your work programme, but I do believe that is an important function of this committee going forward, that we keep that absolutely under scrutiny.
Chair, can I just carry on? Yeah, obviously, when I produce the audit plan going forward, the strategic audit plan, I'll be looking in there what the key risks are to the council. It sounds like this might be one of those key risks, and if that's the case, it'll be included in the plan in one shape or another. So about capital projects, as we speak, we are nearly finished in audit on the Blackfriars development. So they are on our radar, the big capital projects.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
I need to repeat my declaration in connection with Alliance Homes. And just following up the remarks here by Mr. Farmer and also by the lead member, I noticed on page 130, you say, Mr. Angel, other activities during the quarter included providing advice on the adequacy of the governance arrangements for Alliance Homes rather limited. And I wonder whether you were able to actually state what that advice was, or whether it's covered by commercial confidentiality or some other confidentiality rules, whether you could provide that information to this committee now, please.
I can provide it right now, but it was something I was asked to do by the financial finance manager, just to make sure we covering all bases. And because there's a new area, I spoke to some neighbouring councils that have been down this road before and got some idea of guidance. There wasn't much guidance from government on it, and there wasn't. I mean, you've got like your some scheme of delegation. You've got you've got your shareholders agreement, I think it is. Really, I just found just a few minor gaps in it that they might want to consider adding to it. So it wasn't. I was quite pleased to find that most of the areas I expected to be there were there. So it seems like when you report back to the council and what committee and what you agreeing to report back and things like that, I'm glad I can happily share the stuff with you after this meeting, but I haven't got it to hand at the moment.
Thank you. I'd be very grateful, actually, if it could be provided in written form that could then be shared with the other members of the board, and that would be excellent.
Sure. Okay.
Can I just also say, in connection with comments that have been made, that I think one of the principal functions of the board is to ensure there is a free flow of information between the officers of the company and the board, and that can be communicated where appropriate to the principal shareholders. And in particular, I think a principle that needs to be established is that no financial information should be in the minds of officers of the company that is not also shared where it's at a certain level of significance with the members of the board as well. And in particular, I think that information that should be forthcoming is I think there should be a regular profit and loss account. We should have detailed financial projections for the following year and a 5-year financial plan. I think that would help to assure people that we have the financial health of the company and of the council in mind. And can I just also ask you about something else you said? On page 132, you say that it's not clear whether or not there needs to be a separate referral to the Information Commissioner on account of Rother Homes. Could you just tell me whether that issue's been resolved yet, please?
No, I can't say if it's been resolved, but I think our data protection officer, Graham McCullum, thinks that will probably fall on his watch. So, not sure if it needs to be separately registered or not, though.
Right.
I don't. Unless anyone knows. Do you know, Robin?
I declare an interest as director of Alliance Homes Limited. It's a tricky area, this one. It's just come up in another agency that is serviced by the county council. And I think the feeling is probably that agency should have had an independent registration. But the registrar has not ruled as yet. I see that as very analogous to this one. My instinct is the registrar will rule that it requires a separate registration. But watch this space, I think, to be honest, it's very new territory for us. There's quite a lot, I think, still to be sorted out.
Yeah, precisely. I mean, that's why we're unsure about who should be registered separately. Yeah, it's been the action point's been left with Graham McCallum on that one. He'd be coming back to me. When I just follow up the recommendation, I should see what he's done to try and come to a conclusion on that one and register it if necessary. So.
Robin, do you want to comment?
Chairman, it was also just to clarify that it's not just a question of separate registration, it's whether they need to be registered anyway because they're not dealing with personal information at the end of the day. Therefore, they may not need to register because of that. So that's why Graham McCallum's having a look at the whole issue of whether registration is appropriate in the first place, and then secondly, whether separate registration is the right way to go.
I think it's under active consideration, and we must wait the outcome of the consideration. Councillor Thomas.
And there's just one more issue that I'd like to put on the public record, and that is, at the moment, there isn't a firmly established service level agreement between the company and the council. And presumably that has implications for accounting. I wonder if you could make a comment on that.
I think I can say on that is that's one of the things I picked up in my governance advice. We get an SLA, and then I suggested a few things that might want to be in it. So
I think that's extremely important because that's an issue which has been left unresolved for a very, very long time, and I think it's important that it be treated as a matter of the utmost urgency.
I think the key thing is that's got to go in that is how it's paid for, and to be transparent about this. And of course, council mustn't unduly favour a private company. It must pay the going rate. So that all needs to be laid out in black and white.
I've let you stray a little wider on this. I think if we're going to talk more about how we're going to monitor Alliance Homes, the work programme might be a better place than this particular item. Are there any comments on the particular reports? What I think we might do is just give a gentle push, to getting the outstanding issues resolved by the end of this year. It seems to me that things are moving on. Some of them are going to be overtaken by events. We ought to get them off our books, and therefore I think we ought to set a target date so the Chief Executive understands the position. Is that agreed by everybody? Yep. And apart from that, I moved it from the chair, which is, you can do without a second. If I remember my procedure correctly. Now, can I have a mover and a seconder for the internal audit report being noted? Councillor Thomas moves, Councillor Cortell seconded. Everybody agreed? Good. Excellent. We move on to agenda item 8 and Treasury Management. Robin, do you want to say anything? There's nothing, I think, particularly new about this.
Chairman, as you say, it's the standard report for members for the quarter to September. So I think the only issue I'd like to highlight, obviously, is the projection that we might exceed the operational financial boundary that the authorities set earlier in the year. I think it is unlikely because of the slippage we see in the capital programme that actually occur, but at the moment we are updating our medium-term financial plan and capital programme, and therefore we could take a revised position on that, whether we need to make any recommendations to council regarding our boundary there.
I think I have one small comment from the chair. In paragraph 3, we try to estimate a figure for our total investments. That is bound to range about a bit in the very nature of things. And I think in future it might be useful if we have a range rather than simply a single figure. It will give us a better idea of what's happening in the market, I think. But that's for the future. I think we are unlikely to have to go back to council. But again, just to remind you, our procedure is that if we are likely to breach, then we will go back to full council to set a new limit. So there is a control on that. It can't just happen. With those observations, Councillor Cortell.
Thank you, Chair. I noticed that SIL seems to be very conservatively estimated at 281,000, 21-22, with nothing budgeted in future years. Is it just my perception that this is cautiously estimated, or is it a realistic position?
Yeah, I think it's probably a case of not counting on the money until it arrives. As you know, it only becomes payable once spade hits ground. So pre-estimate the likely receipt timing of that. We know the overall liability, we have that information, but we tend not to make assumptions around future receipts unless we've got some very reliable information that we know that's going to happen.
So presumably that's likely to be a bonus which might help our financial position.
Obviously, in terms of cash, yes, it's good for our cash position, but clearly there are restrictions around how the SIL money is used and how it is deployed, if you like, in terms of supporting infrastructure improvements in the district. But yeah, in terms of our cash position, until those projects come forward, then it creates a healthier cash position for the authority.
Okay. My next question, Chair, concerns the overall borrowing, which you've been talking about. And I wondered whether we're still on track for the major investment that makes up a substantial amount of that borrowing. I'm looking at a borrowing of 46.1 million in 21-22, going up to 48.9 million in 23. At the bottom of page 40, sorry, bottom of page 141. 3 lines from the bottom of page 141.
So, Chairman, so that reflects the programme as set out above there. So clearly the projection is that we will incur that borrowing. As I think I said earlier, I think there will be slippage in the programme. Therefore, it will happen later. And it currently shows in the approved programme. This is why we're doing the revisions at the moment and revising it for members later in October and November. So yeah, it's based upon that programme above. So if they are delivered on that time frame, then those borrowings will be incurred. But as I say, I think particularly around the Alliance Homes projects, I imagine they will want to take place as quickly as the current programme suggests.
What about North East Bexhill?
So yeah, so North East Bexhill is coming out of the revised capital programme. The latest monitoring, that's no longer there as part of that.
Of course, sorry, yes. Sorry, it's got some blankets to out. Just noted. Thanks. Yes, it is. Yes. My last question, Chair, concerns page 142, capital financing requirement, and you've got the unfinanced capital expenditure. I presume that's simply that the capital expenditure hasn't been sought or applied for at the moment.
So that effectively relates back to the borrowing that we would need to undertake. So when you're looking at financing of your capital program, some of it will come from capital receipts or revenue monies or whatever it might be, and the unfinanced position there becomes your financing requirement, which is effectively your borrowing requirement.
Thank you.
Can I just respond to the SIL question there? I mean, there's no guarantee that SIL will be used to fund our capital programme. There's a review, obviously, on SIL that's being taken at the moment, which is further delayed by the unfortunate departure of the SIL officer. But SIL can be used for a variety of things, but we hope it would be used for the capital programme. But of course, it's not necessarily our money to dictate that.
No further questions. Can we note the Council's Treasury activities for the second financial quarter? Everybody happy with that? Yes. In which case we can move on to a lengthy table of risks. Robin, do you want to lead us into this?
Chairman, I'll just give a quick brief overview. As members will expect, obviously this year continues to be dominated by the pandemic, and obviously what we try to do in this report is reflect on our normal corporate risks, and then I've also provided you with some commentary from heads of service about the continued impact of COVID on their service provision. So in terms of the actual corporate risk register, there's just 3 items that we picked up there in terms of the spending review, and obviously the delays that's been happening regarding the spending review are now looking like it will be crystallised and happen shortly, and therefore there is an increased risk for the authority in terms of its settlements over the next few years. Highlighting the loss of staff and recruitment issues, and members will be very well aware of a number of departments where we've struggled to recruit staff or retain staff, and therefore that becomes a real risk for the authority going forward, and particularly where we lose staff and lose knowledge from the authority as well. I like that. A new risk we've incorporated is failure of a partner public body. Whilst I haven't got anything on the horizon that suggests any partner will be likely to be in that position, I think it's probably worth having that on record as a risk that we need to consider, that a partner may well run into financial difficulties, and we understand may well be us as well if we don't achieve the financial stability programme that we've set out. So clearly there is a risk to this authority of continued pressure on public finances and the reductions in local government funding. I'm happy to go through the appendices in a bit more detail if members want to ask questions about those, and obviously I can make comment on the heads of service commentary, but if you have any more detailed questions about their commentary, I'll go back to them and ask for a written response from members.
Yes, I just had a comment really rather than anything else. We haven't got a national fuel shortage, but we have got panic buying, which has added to the strain. So that one is actually materialized rather more than the 3 I think that we expected. I'm taking it that all our recent experience with home working provides us with a more than adequate response.
I think in terms of our sort of office-based services, then yes, I think the whole shift through the pandemic to home working has given us an awful lot more resilience. The changes in the IT in order to enable that to happen, including things like Teams where we can have meetings remotely, been very, very good. The issues we've got are particularly with those contracts where, for example, waste, where if they are struggling to get fuel supplies, then that may well affect our ability to collect the waste on as per the contract. So those sort of issues are being considered at the moment. We're likely to be having discussions, I imagine, later this week, early next week, about whether there are issues for any of our contractors in terms of securing supply of fuel, and whether that means any deterioration in the level of service. Obviously, we'll keep members up to date as to the information we get to hear. I'm also aware from previously when we were making Brexit plans, there was a whole raft of work, probably Richard knows more about this than me probably, around planning for controlling the access to petrol stations and where to put vehicles and lorries and all that sort of information. So that's probably quite apt that was done recently, and I imagine we will be looking at that across the county in terms of emergency planning and control over the next week or so, depending on how things pan out with the fuel or crisis in terms of accessing fuel.
Yes, the other one which possibly needs restating in the light of what's going on is, of course, the possibility of lorry drivers not being available to our waste team isn't really caught yet in the way we've phrased the risk list. That clearly has moved quite a long way up the agenda because for a whole variety of reasons, mainly I suspect the pandemic, but partly Brexit, partly, but mainly pandemic, because the examiners simply aren't working at the moment, and therefore, even if you are a potential lorry driver, you can't necessarily qualify. So that seems to me quite a big and new and quite significant risk, given the importance of our waste service.
I think you're right, Chairman. I'm aware, obviously, over the recent time that our waste contractor has struggled to maintain its HGV drivers, has had to make use of agency drivers, and clearly their ability to retain agency drivers has become difficult because they're going off to find other work that's paid more effectively at the end of the day. So it is an issue. I think we do talk about loss of staff. You could argue that is part of that equation, but as you say, it should be perhaps pulled out a bit more as a specific item around our contractors losing particular skills and staff. Might not be due to shortage of skills such as HGVs, but there might be other issues that where we lose key staff within our contractors that then affect our ability to deliver those services on the ground.
I think if we could ask you to take a long, hard look at that risk, because of course wage levels are also going up because of the shortages, which is a good thing for the drivers, but not necessarily a good thing for our contractors. Are there any other questions? Councillor Cortell, and then Mr. Farmer, and then Councillor Thomas.
Thank you, Councillor Barnes. On page 151, under the Housing and Customer Services clause, I notice that in customer services, the call length has been increased because the nature of inquiries are getting more complex. And I also noticed that call abandonments have increased. Now that's something I've had quite a bit of feedback about as a ward councillor. And in fact, in the customer services survey that I filled out last Friday, it seemed quite a glaring gap that was a question that hadn't been asked about call abandonment, because people get fed up with waiting after a very long time and think they'd be waiting forever. And I had intended to write to the customer services manager and to the relevant portfolio holder about that precise point, but as I read it in this audit report, I thought I'd just flag it up.
Chairman, I think you can see from the actual bullet point on that page that the head of service has taken some action in terms of diverting his front of house staff towards the phones in order to improve the capacity for that. So hopefully that's making an impact, but clearly you can make contact directly with him and find out the current situation.
Thank you. Apology, Chair. I was thinking of performance. Sure.
Right, well, my queries are on risk, and just looking at the key ones that have been identified, the residual risks seems on a number of these much lower than I would expect to see on things that obviously the committee is concerned about. If you take major projects, which we've talked about a lot, and the risks we believe associated with them, yet the risk level on that, with a residual risk of 5, seems to me extraordinarily low. Same to a certain extent on the delivery of savings and income targets. It's a huge challenge, the programme you've set yourselves, and therefore to have a residual risk of only 9, again, I just think it does seem to me not identifying risk at the level I would have expected.
I think I would agree with you from the chair. I think probably this was stated in this form before we embarked on the new capital programme. As yet, we have not that many major projects. Most of them are preliminary work going on. So it probably is not too late to revise. I expect at this stage it's probably reasonably accurate, but it shortly will not be. And I think that that's the important lesson to learn, because as we actually venture on various projects, that's going to be quite a risky business, I think, particularly housing. I don't know whether you feel the risk was understated on some of the earlier projects. We're mixed up with sea change and various office projects on North East Bexhill.
I think this is why it's a difficult one to assess objectively, if you like. There's a level of subjectiveness to your opinion. I think my opinion in terms of coming up with the scoring is based upon the fact that we've got very robust project management processes and people in place. We've got tight financial management control on all of our major projects. And that's always been a very key part of what we've done as an authority. So I think my expectation is it's while the scale is becoming higher risk in terms of scale for the authority, if it does go wrong, I think we've got the processes in place that should mitigate that.
I think Mr. Farmer's point is not the end score after all the mitigation, but the initial score seemed to him.
Well, both. I think the
rather
initial
low.
does seem low.
Yeah.
And I take Robin's point in terms of mitigation. He's got the knowledge and experience to say that mitigations are valid. But the original score of only 9 does seem low.
Yeah, I suppose it is based upon experience. That is my experience of this authority, and I think that the project around North East Bexhill again highlighted the fact that we didn't commit to significant expenditure with ahead of any sound agreement in place with the parties. Therefore, our system and our approach to projects and delivery of projects should always be a very sound one in order to mitigate the risks around those. And we don't embark on projects where the risk is so high that we are effectively gambling, if you like, with the authority's money or public's money. So I think our processes and procedures are sound enough. I take on board that the scale of it now, if it does go wrong, has a significant impact on the authority. Also things like, for example, the Blackfriars and the major project there, it's very much a phased project. So you then tend to limit your liability to each phase, and therefore you would not progress to phase 2 or 3 until you've dealt with the early part of the scheme. So it's how we approach it, which I think is the right approach. But I do understand members' concern that maybe we haven't reflected the impact if all of that disappeared. We didn't have those things in place.
I think my worry about the initial score is twofold, actually. I suspect Mr. Palmer's may be the same. On both sides of the equation, things are moving. The scale of projects are going up, and our level of reserves has gone down. And therefore, what looked more comfortable looks less comfortable now, because if something went badly wrong, we could be knocked sideways as an authority, which wasn't true, I think, on any project up till now. May not be true, but I think what we're saying is time probably for another look at the initial risk problem. You may still end up with a relatively low score, because I do agree with you, our projects are well managed, and I think I'm happier with the mitigation score than the initial statement. But I think since it's been raised, if we could have a look at that one,
Happy to say that.
it will be useful.
I think the issue of resources is one. I think on the audit report, it commented that the estates team have been very busy, involved with projects, and are stretched. Well, they're going to get stretched even more, aren't they, when these additional projects come, and your staff retention issues and recruitment. Again, one would guess with these new projects, you're going to need more project managers, more people, and if you can't get them, so those risks link into the project risks.
And I think that is very key in terms of our approach, isn't it? What I'd expect to see is that the projects effectively are, until things, resources are in place, then they're not going to progress very quickly. I think you're right in terms of our estates department. That's probably the bigger risk, is more about our general estate rather than about our key projects, because there's a lot of focus on the key projects. So what might happen over time is if resources are stretched, then the day job suffers rather than the projects. In my mind, that's because the focus is on delivery of the project. So my more concern is about perhaps a day-to-day job if that becomes stretched in terms of resources. So far, we've been successful in recruiting people like Stephen Marsden as project manager for the Blackfriars project. He's very experienced and got a great understanding of what he's trying to deliver. Therefore, as long as we continue with that kind of approach, then we should be fine. But clearly, as you say, there is a risk that if they start not to happen, or and we can't recruit, then that will become very difficult for the authority to actually deliver the project in the first place, which is why I'd hope that we haven't committed ourselves at that point to delivering, because we haven't got the resources in place. So,
well, I suppose the risk of failing to deliver the project is also a risk.
yes, as long as there's no financial commitment on the back of it, then that's fine. There's a reputational damage maybe and other issues, but not necessarily a financial risk to the authority if it hasn't committed itself.
Councillor Thomas.
That's right. That's all my question.
Councillor Cortell.
Thank you. On page 154, the last sentence of this report, it states, most of these issues are not unique to our service, and some are likely to continue well beyond the pandemic as a result of reduced office space. Now, I had asked the question at both Cabinet and Overview and Scrutiny Committee about whether office space would be reduced as a result of the Town Hall project. And Ben Hook had basically said, well, this is something to be looked at later. We can't really give you an answer at this stage. I now see that there are problems as a result of reduced office space, which is what I'd feared. And I'm just flagging this out.
I don't want to put you on the spot, but I think probably.
Yeah, this is just why when I was asked to comment to the Chief Executive Secretary, how is COVID is affecting the internal, and this is just verbatim what I said to her in an email. But I mean, when I'm talking about problems of office space, I'm talking purely from an internal audit perspective. Difficult to meet people face to face. They will more and more be working from home on a regular basis, and there aren't as many desks now in the offices, so they share So whereas someone might be in 5 days a week before, they might only be in 2 now, and it's just catching them when they're in. But it makes it more difficult for us. If we need to speak to someone, I would use Teams, and that works quite well a lot of the time. Sometimes, especially when you've got a lot of small minor further follow-up questions, it's just easier sometimes rather than play email tennis than to speak to someone face to face and you get the answer straight away. Especially when we need to see documentation they've got to hand, which they won't have if they're at home. So that's really what we're talking purely from the internal audit perspective on that one.
Yes, I think on the other issue you were raising, which is about the town hall project, we're not at a stage yet where that has been approved. The design work is going on. I think any risk that comes from disruption from that will have to go on the risk register, but probably not at this moment, because I don't think there is any risk at this moment of disruption to the town hall work. Councillor Thomas?
I'm sorry, I have to say, I will ask a question after all. It's simply this. I mean, obviously, there's a great deal in the news at the moment about sharp increases in energy prices. How vulnerable would the council be if energy prices were to increase other sort of margins of things?
Robin, I think you've got to answer that one.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I think that'd be a bit unfair on Gary to speculate on the impact of energy costs. We've just recently signed a new deal with our energy supplier, so those prices are now fixed. So, yeah.
I think it might be worth exploring more detail outside this meeting, Councillor Thomas, because there will be elements of commercial sensitivity in that one, I think. Are there any more questions? No, in which case I think we go back to the recommendation. We've asked Robin to take away one particular risk and look at it in some detail. So obviously we'll need a report back on that at our next meeting, possible. Or would you like to?
Chairman, because I won't be here.
I know.
So I'll do the work and discuss it with Ben Hook so that we can get a view. But Gary Angel's actually picking up the overall lead on risk management going forward, so they will.
If we can at the next meeting, but if necessary, I'd rather have a good report rather than a rush report. Other than that, we simply have to note the report. Can I move that from the chair? Everybody happy with that? Thank you. In which case we come on to, and I welcome Richard Parker Harding to this meeting. We decided at an earlier meeting that we would take a look department by department at the risks that department faced. And I'm very grateful that we've got a detailed report via Robin, but I imagine a lot of it came from you. So without more ado, let me open it to the members to ask any questions they wish of the Head of Environmental Services. Yes.
I just don't understand the Appendix A reports where there are 2 tables with different figures in, and it doesn't explain what the 2 tables mean.
Thank you. My understanding is the 2 tables. The first table is the risks with the mitigations in place. The second table is the risks without mitigations in place.
Right.
The second table shows all the risks which should be rated without any mitigations, and then the first table shows the mitigations.
I see.
Which
Yes.
reduce the
Right.
risk.
Yes. Now I understand it. Okay. Thank you.
Councillor Hammer and then Councillor Cortell.
Thank you, Chair. Just looking at the staffing levels, and I'm sure it's very challenging as it is in all departments. So where exactly do you advertise? I think I've seen it on my alerts for several different departments, but where exactly do you advertise and what's the biggest issue you've come across? Is it salary or is it reason? Thank you.
Thank you. Obviously, where we advertise depends very much on the job itself. If it's a professional job, then there is a specific specialist environmental health jobs advert which is sent out by the Chartered Institute of Environmental Health. So they'll all be advertised on that site. All the jobs get advertised on the public sector websites, and we also advertise locally. And actually, what we find now, also professional jobs, is that we have several officers have LinkedIn accounts. We put adverts on LinkedIn, and we get responses in that way. Recently, when we've been advertising, we've been trying to recruit some additional COVID information officers. We haven't received any responses at all. I think that obviously when we advertised COVID information officers at the beginning of the pandemic, we had 20 applications. The last time we advertised, we haven't received any, which I think shows you that the people are returning to their normal jobs. When we advertised before, people had been furloughed, and therefore they apply to us. In terms of recruitment, obviously, coastal authorities always have difficulty recruiting because we can only recruit for 180 degrees. We can't recruit people from the sea. So we've always had difficulty in recruiting. Therefore, traditionally, we've always trained staff. The majority of our environmental health officers actually started work as business support officers or as technical officers, and they've trained up to become environmental health officers over the years. And we've always maintained a very healthy training budget to enable us to do that. I'm pleased to say that we do have a good reputation as an environmental health service. Being a shared service has enhanced our reputation, and therefore we do get people applying to us because they know we provide a good service. We are a respected environmental health service within Sussex and nationally. Obviously, we have a number of officers who are well known nationally, and they speak at national conferences, and thereby people, when they see someone speaking at a national conference, they are attracted to come and work for that authority. So we're fortunate in that way. Although we don't sort of pay any higher salaries than our neighbours, we have a good reputation, which allows us to employ staff who wouldn't perhaps normally expect to come to us. And at the moment, we have a number of vacancies which we are advertising. So hopefully we will get some applications. Sometimes you can be lucky, you can be unlucky with applications. I think what's significant this year is that we have been able to appoint an apprentice environmental health officer. She's just started. It's a 4-year training program, which is a long time to train. But because it's the great advantage of the apprentice route now is that obviously people who are apprentices actually work for the authority. She has 1 day a week at university, which is done online, which is also excellent. But hopefully we will be able to appoint from existing staff a second apprentice next year. And that will again enable us to have some subsection planning. As a department, we are getting older. We do need to bring new staff in. And also the great advantage of the apprentice programme is that all the training costs are met by the apprenticeship levy, not the authority paying for itself. So that's been a huge advance in recent years.
Thank you very much for the answer. I love the word apprenticeship. You sound like you've really got it together in your department, and I very rarely had any problems at all when speaking with the council to get things sorted. Well done, Richard.
Thank you, Chair. I'm referring to air quality on page 160. I noticed that shortly before we left the European Union, the EU issued the United Kingdom with a final warning over its level of nitro dioxide. I noticed, however, that in Rother, we are meeting UK air quality objectives. But is that because UK air quality objectives are lower than what existed when we were in the EU? Or are we doing fairly well in Rother and not being a beneficiary of a sliding standard?
Thank you. Thank you. The UK standard is exactly the same as the EU standard. Obviously, one of the consequences of Brexit was that all the existing EU directives and standards were translated directly into UK legislation. So we are still working, although they're now called UK standards, they're exactly the same as the EU standards were before. We're very fortunate in Rother in some ways, because obviously we don't have major motorways, we don't have an airport, and therefore our nitrogen dioxide levels are well below the UK levels. Having said that, we do have issues with other pollutants such as ozone. That's because we receive the pollution from the European continent, which blows over the channel and reacts to the sunlight and produces high levels of ozone. So although we don't have issues with particulates or nitrogen dioxide, we do have an issues with high levels of ozone during the summer, which we monitor at Rye Harbour and at Lunston Heath. But strangely, actually, ozone isn't a pollutant which is controlled by legislation. There is no national limit for ozone because it is an intercontinental pollutant. But it is a concern, and we do obviously measure the ozone because we're concerned about it. And through an organisation called Sussex Air, which we belong to, if there are high levels of ozone predicted the next day, then we send out an ozone alert. Anybody can sign up to an ozone alert, and they will get a text message to tell them next day there'll be high levels of ozone, that they're suffering from any respiratory disease, or they're particularly sensitive to high levels of ozone. They'll get a text and they'll know either to increase their medication or to stay indoors. So in a way, that is actually outside our sort of statutory obligation, but we do it because I know that ozone is a particular issue in this area, and I know that the effects on vulnerable people means that we should take action.
Thank you very much.
I notice mentioned here of something which I think is concerning many residents, and that's the problem of flight. It's very much coming to the fore at the moment. And I wonder whether you could actually make some comments about that. You know, what policies you have, what further measures, if any, can be taken, whether it's just a thing about which is very difficult.
Thank you. Yes, fly tipping is extraordinarily difficult to detect. Obviously, the only time we can actually take it to prosecution is if actually we witness the fly tipping occurring, and it's quite hard to get that evidence to identify who the actual fly tipper was. Obviously, the people who do fly tipping generally are reasonably sophisticated, and they'll cover up their registration numbers when they're actually doing the fly tipping. They don't do the fly tipping when there's obviously an officer around. Frustratingly, we are restricted. I find it frustrating that we are restricted in being able to use covert surveillance cameras. We can only carry out covert surveillance now. We're getting an order from a magistrate. We have to be convinced that there isn't any what they call collateral intrusion. So we can't put up cameras in lay-bys because we might be recording other people doing other things in lay-bys, which is seen to be interfering with their personal habits. So therefore, that makes fly tipping detection very difficult. And the other thing I find frustrating is that when we do a prosecution, we do an awful lot of work getting evidence to do a prosecution. We get to court, and then the person gets a very small fine or gets a suspended sentence. We have costs of hundreds of thousands of pounds, and they get costs ordered against them of £1,000, which we again have difficulty in recovering from them. So fly tipping is something which, as a local authority, we are trying the best we can deal with. I think we haven't really been given the tools to do the work. We do also detect people who have left evidence in the fly tip of where the waste occurred from, so that every fly tip is examined by officers. If we come across a name and address, that will be followed up, and then that is an offence from the person who the waste originated from. So the householder who contracted a man in a white van through Facebook, paid them £30 to get rid of their waste, and they leave a name and address in that waste, we will contact them. Normally we'll issue them a fixed penalty notice for their failure to comply with their duty of care compared to their waste. But it obviously acts as a deterrent in some ways, but we're not actually catching the fly tipper, because they never obviously know who the fly tipper was. It was just somebody who turned up in a white van and they gave them £30 and they took their waste away. Obviously, extremely stupid thing to do, and they end up with a fixed penalty notice of £200. We have recently tried a new method, which I think will be more successful. Working with the police, we have did a stop operation with the police where we stopped vehicles on the A21. The police checked the vehicles for their MOT. Customs and excise checked whether it was red diesel or not. When we checked all their paperwork, so anyone carrying waste must have a waste permit. And in that way, if people aren't carrying waste and don't have a waste permit, and they don't produce a waste permit in 7 days, then we'll issue them a fixed penalty notice of £350. If that is a deterrent. Obviously, we are dependent on the police to do those stop operations, and there may be other demands from the police at certain times, particularly during party conferences. So what we will try and carry out a number of operations during the year with the police, stop vehicles on the A259 and A21 and other places. And I think doing that, although we may not catch many people, I think word will get out that we are doing it. Stay away from bother, because we are carrying out these operations. Hopefully by doing all these things, we will reduce the amount of fly tipping going on, but I find it extremely frustrating. It's very challenging. I just don't think we've been given the tools to do the enforcement work that the government expects us to do.
Very much for that answer. Thank you.
I have one question. Looking at the areas of risk on page 156, I wasn't quite sure why you were distinguishing between national and political change and new legislation. Is that a hangover from the past? In other words, does that reflect Brexit? Because it seems a bit odd to distinguish between those two when you have a government in power that's got another 3 years to go.
Well, actually, when I was looking through this report, all the things we do, it suddenly struck me that when I actually first started working in environment 30 years ago, almost none of those things we actually did. So I think what the issue with national and political change is that all the time we're being given new legislation and somehow we're expected to do it without really particularly any additional resources, and we have to get our officers trained. So recently we have a whole area around antisocial behaviour. That is new legislation which has come along and has transferred a lot of the responsibility of antisocial behaviour away from the police into ourselves, although we work very closely with the police on it. That's completely new legislation, and that's almost a new political, with small p, change in the way that we operate. And other issues around which we now deal with, which obviously alcohol licensing was a big thing when it came in 2005, but that was a completely new area of work. And obviously recently we've had the whole animal welfare licensing. Again, a completely new area of work, which was has to be carried out by the Environmental Health Service, but all our staff needs to be trained quite quickly into how to conduct these inspections, and obviously perhaps reflecting we are a nation of animal lovers. The actual animal welfare licensing is probably the most complex form of licensing we have. It's extraordinarily prescribed. And so really that risk really is, I think, is just the way that governments of all colours come up with new legislation, which they expect local government to implement very quickly with no real additional resources.
Chair, if you forgive me, sometimes I just can't resist a little bit of frivolity. But you're given a very serious and sensible answer about it. But when I read at home that you were predicting national political change at a rate of 4 out of 6, I became quite excited. I would sincerely hope that your paranormal powers are considerably greater than that of the average gypsy race.
I can possibly comment.
If we're done and dusted, I think we can probably say thank you to Richard for coming along tonight. I think it's very useful to get a full grasp of how much work your department actually does. And so simply by looking at the risk register, we've actually informed ourselves about a great deal more. And thank you very much for coming tonight. Which brings us, I think, to the work programme, does it not? Now, look across at the lead member. In a sense, I think one of the things we do need to think about tonight is how we're going to monitor Alliance Homes Limited. I don't know if you had any ideas or whether anybody around this table has particular ideas about how often we're going to do it, how we're going to do it, and what information we require. Councillor Thomas, obviously, well, I was looking to either one of you. I really don't mind who goes first.
Well, when I was chair of this committee, I did go on a course, which both Robin and Malcolm always regretted ever sending me on. And I do know that this if you have a company that is wholly owned by the council, then it comes more or less as the same as the council. You can receive its accounts and do as you do with the council's accounts. So I would have thought the minimum that you should be doing is reviewing the accounts on a yearly basis. Whether you want to get maybe a 6-monthly update, if that's necessary, probably not necessary now because there's very little activity. And I suppose the other thing, Chair, is that we may have to think about is the actual makeup of this committee and whether it is suitable to have directors on this committee. Not that you cast any aspersions on present company, but obviously if their own directors are reviewing their own company, that might not be the best practice either. And it will become a bit of a problem because if directors of Alliance Homes can't serve on planning, on cabinet or on audit, there's not many people left, which is a bit of a shame, but that's one maybe to look at later.
On that last point, it occurred to me that one might create a subcommittee to get around the problem, because that would free us to do the rest of the audit work, but would take us away from the sensitive area.
Very good suggestion.
So maybe the Constitution Group could take a look at that. It is being reviewed at the moment, the Constitution. Councillor Thomas.
Thank you. Basically, just to let members of this committee know, I personally am now doing the board directors course of the Henley Business School, and there's a lot of ancillary reading to go with that. And I'm also in the process of self-education. So I'm trying to study the Companies Act, academic articles about the relationship between social housing on the one hand, and on the other hand, the sort of benefit system. I'm trying to read myself into the job completely, and also to put out to members of the board the information which I'm gathering through that course and through other means. What the board of directors have been doing is we've been engaged in a process which is all about enabling the board to have the maximum amount of relevant information and to make sure that we can maintain this crucial distinction between governance on the one hand, which is the job of the board, and management, which is the job of the chief operating officer and the other people concerned with that. And this flow of information, we have established a number of things already. We've established, for example, that every month, which is the regularity with which we're having meetings at the moment, the chief operating officer will give us a written report on what has been going on. We've also established the point that there will be regular site reports so we can see what's happening on each individual site, what progress is being made. And I think we're now establishing a new principle. There'll be a financial report every month. So it's very important the board keeps abreast of everything happening within the company on behalf of the company and the members of this committee and the other committees. So I think that's absolutely crucial. We also are saying, excuse me, that we want to have sequential reports on how sites are developed. Robin has already said the way in which we're not financially committed totally to the whole of the process of building, but it actually takes place in stages. So we as a board would like to know exactly what the financial commitment is at each stage, what income can be anticipated, what outgoings there will be. So we as a board are very, very determined on your behalf to make sure we have all the necessary information to ensure that we don't get into the kind of situation that happened with Croydon. Also, we have decided to make an approach to our companion board in Wilden so we can learn from them what's going right, what would they do differently, so we can actually learn from other companies. So I think we are trying to do all that we can to inform ourselves and to get information which we can pass on to you and to make sure there is a rigorous process for scrutiny, as you would expect.
Mr. Palmer.
I've got some experience having run a company for many years, most of my career. The sort of information you might find useful when you're running something like this is to set yourself a dashboard with some key indicators on it, set the targets against those key indicators and monitor those indicators. And this committee maybe then could get a feedback of how you're progressing against those key indicators, because you don't want to look at the whole mass of it. You want to look at the key things that are important. So I would suggest that might be useful for you.
Can I say that the chair has actually been very useful in suggesting that? I'd like to thank Councillor Barnes has been ahead of this. But I just wanted to add one further point, and that is a very key thing, is to increase the resources of the board. And so the most important thing we're doing at the moment, I think, is recruitment process. So we want to make sure that the board has, I think the main thing actually is a considerable amount of financial expertise. That I think is the key appointment. But we are seeking to enlarge the board so we draw in the range of experience and expertise that we need to enhance our decision making. That's the most important thing we're doing. And that's involved an audit by members of the board of the skills that we have, and therefore see where the gaps are so we can fill those gaps.
Yes, I won't add very much, but I totally agree with Mr. Farmer. It's where things are diverging from plan that you need to know what's happening. What I think we probably need to make clear, because it doesn't seem to be very clear, is that until about a fortnight ago, I think probably getting on for 3 weeks now, we had neither properties nor capital. We were simply a board in embryo learning our trade. So I think a lot of people assume we've been up and running, whereas in fact, we are still actually neither complete as a board, and we don't have an SLA yet with the appropriate staff. But we have now a project, as you will see from the capital figures, and therefore we now have a role. And we have also, although the terms have yet to be settled, quite a substantial borrowing. But again, I think I'm right in saying we don't yet know at what rate of interest. So it's all a little embryonic to scrutinise at the moment. What I would suggest is that we make an annual report alongside the annual accounts, and it may be right in our early years to have an interim report just to reassure people, certainly in the first year of operation. I don't think we should wait for the annual board and accounts. Councillor Thomas.
Yes, I entirely agree with that. But another change we've made, which I think is a good decision, is we've decided that in addition to a possibly technically phrased report, that we would also produce another report, which would be in more ordinary English, so it would be intelligible to a range of people. And I think that's a very key decision, because we want to be seen to be democratically accountable.
Councillor Quarter.
I agree with a number of things that have been said by yourself, Chair, and by Councillor. First of all, the plain English issue. I think it was superbly covered in the Rother accounts, where there was essentially a management account at the beginning, and that is the sort of thing with objectives and narrative that Alliance Homes could produce as well. I'd like to formally move your suggestion, Councillor Barnes, that we create a subcommittee to monitor Alliance Homes, obviously excluding the directors of Alliance Homes from that subcommittee.
Can I accept that motion subject to checking that the Constitution permits it? And may we vary it, if it doesn't, to suggest the Constitution Review Group modify the Constitution accordingly? I don't want to lose the initiative, but I think we've got to phrase it carefully, because I'm not quite sure what the Constitution says about subcommittees. Does Councillor Quartel's motion have a seconder?
If I could just explain the motion.
Yes, please.
Thank you. It was to create a subcommittee of the Audit Committee to monitor Alliance Homes, so that there's no conflict of interest with the two existing directors of Alliance Homes who are on the audit.
If it has no seconder, could I make a suggestion from the chair that we take the issue away, because it's a real issue? And I think Councillor Quartel solution looks to me the right solution. We need to check its legality, constitutionality. So if we can resolve that issue is taken, if necessary, to the Constitution Group, if not necessary, then obviously to the next meeting of the Audit Committee, if it has got the power to create a subcommittee. Councillor Thomas.
Very simply, I would just like to think about that. I would like to consider it very carefully. As simple as that.
I think that's all we can do tonight, Councillor Quartel.
Yep. Chairman, I was also just going to say that we'll take that away to have a look at how that might be managed and organised, but also to look at the parameters of, from an audit committee point of view, what it would be looking at, because it's not about, as we talked about before, it's not about performance, it's about risk and governance and those sort of issues. So we need to think about what the role of it is, because we're not a finance committee, we're not looking at the activity, those terms. Therefore, we just need to be sure that what we're scrutinising within the audit committee fits in with the terms of reference for audit committee work as well. And that's why we need to probably take it back through the Constitution, just to look at it and review it in terms of those things. Because other aspects of what they do as a company will be reported through to council anyway as part of the shareholders agreement. So it's making sure we don't double up on the work and making sure that we focus on the things and the issues that audit committee
should be focused upon.
Councillor Quartel.
Which brings me to a further point that we suggest to the Overview and Scrutiny Committee that they form a subcommittee to meet occasionally to look at the performance of
I've got to rule you out of order on that one, I'm afraid. I don't think it's our business to recommend anything to Overview and Scrutiny. I'm sure as members of Overview and Scrutiny may well take a view when we get to that committee. But I don't think it's for us to recommend that. Whereas I think it is for us to recommend that we find a way of enabling some members of the council to continue on audit while not scrutinising their own business. And that's really what we're asking the officers to look at. Councillor Thomas.
I just think one of the things that's important is that we set up a housing company. We did not set up a department of the council to do the work. And so I think we have to think very carefully about how we protect the company as a company whilst enabling there to be proper scrutiny and oversight. I think a great deal of thought needs to be given into maintaining that distinction.
Yeah. It's an important distinction because the company is a legal entity and its directors have responsibilities as directors, not as councillors. So it's quite important that we find ways of creating the right Chinese walls at both the company level and at member stroke director level, but also at officer level, because we need a de facto separation in order that we can actually perform properly and be scrutinised properly by the shareholders.
And we need to maintain that Chinese wall because the council is ultimately a political organisation, whereas the company is a non-political one. So that's why it's very important to find the right way to maintain that distinction.
But thank you for raising it, Councillor Quartel. I think it's good to give the problems an airing, and then we'll send our officers away, try and come up with a solution. And it won't be buried as an issue. I think unless there are any other comments on the work, Mr. Farmer.
I was just going to comment on some experience I've had of having a separate company. When I was a governor of the Sussex Coast College,
Yes.
We set up a separate company called Plaza Trading because we wanted to do commercial work that didn't attract the normal problems you have in the teaching profession of pensions and all the other liabilities. So we set up a company separately. I and two other governors became directors. So it was a very similar separate company, which was audited separately. So I'm just asking, I presume that this company you're setting up will be audited, financial auditors. Will it be the same auditors or are you going to have separate auditors?
I suspect we will have separate auditors.
Separate would be preferable.
Yeah.
Because those auditors could report back to this committee.
Yes, that's
Yeah.
You see.
In theory, ultimately, the accounts will be consolidated into the authority's accounts. They'll be part of the group.
Yeah, we have the same
situation.
thing. You
So
have a
they'll be-
group and you
So
consolidate.
the accounts will be reported through to this committee anyway as part of that process.
I think too, we may want to look at some of the lessons from Wielden to see how they've coped, because they've been running for a number of years. We are still very much with L plates up, I think. So I think a very useful discussion and helpful probably to our officers, but it's really the responsibilities of the shareholder which will be being looked at by Overview and Scrutiny, and to a lesser extent this committee. But this company is really a major source of risk to the council. So it's right that this committee also has a role in looking at it and making sure that it's not going to be knocked sideways. So I think both those committees have a role, and I'm grateful to the lead member for what he said at Cabinet about that, which I think was very useful. If there's no other business, we take note of the work programme. In which case, can I thank you all for your attendance, particularly those who've come a long way, and declare this meeting closed at 8:25.